Well, welcome to you all, and thank you, Naira, who makes this happen. And even though 10 minutes ago this room looked very different, now we're all sitting down around, more or less, in a circle. It is both a pleasure and a challenge to be introducing to you Michael Pifer. It's a pleasure because he's a lovely person, sometimes unaware of his intellectual prowess, and a challenge precisely because he is so intellectually gifted. I fear my words will not do justice to his considerable achievements. So let me state the obvious first. Michael Pifer is without a doubt one of the most talented scholars I have met anywhere. He's an original and provocative thinker, and as I think you will see, also a careful and meticulous one. We are lucky to have had him here at the University of Michigan, as I'm peeping to see you, as a graduate student, and now as our colleague. Michael Pifer has created a field of his own. Trained in comparative literature, he brings world literatures in dialogue with global history and religious studies. His intellectual vision is grounded in philology. Through a close reading of texts in multiple original languages, from Armenian to Persian to Turkish and Arabic, he conceptualizes literature as a medium of communication between Muslims, Christians, and Jews to imagine literary contact in Asia Minor and more broadly across the Mediterranean. Michael resists conventional periodizations and frameworks based on the nation state as a unit of analysis, a point of departure that has skewed so much of our understanding of pre-modern world literatures, cultures, and religions. There have been few scholarly attempts to place Armenian literature within these larger frames, despite the large presence of Armenians in the region over the last millennium. Rather than frame the Mediterranean as a bounded geographical zone, he examines the ways in which Armenians have been interconnected and integrated with the peoples and places around them. Michael found a brilliant heuristic or analytic for his dissertation. His analysis of the figure of the stranger or the gharib that appears in Armenian, Persian, Turkish, and Arabic mystical poetry has allowed him a way to engage his interests in contact and exchange between Christians, Muslims, and Jewish textual communities. He analyzes the ways Armenian poetry communicated with Persian mystical poetry to shape its own literary conventions and themes at the very same moment when Turkish was emerging into writing. Michael's work offers a deeper, more refined understanding of cosmopolitan medieval and early modern societies across religious and ethnic collectives. It is not surprising that Michael was awarded the ProQuest Distinguished Dissertation Award in 2015 and the prestigious National Endowments for the Humanities Fellowship in 2016, which gave him a precious year to turn his dissertation into a book manuscript now entitled Kindred Voices, a literary history of medieval Anatolia between 1250 and 1350. These awards are testimony to the significance of his work, which offers a critical reassessment of common themes and objects of inquiry on global literatures in the modern as well as the pre-modern world. Today, he will talk to us about a new project on Armenian riddles deployed by the 12th century Catholicos Nerses Shnorhali, composed in Middle Armenian, to help us understand the riddled words and world that Nerses Shnorhali's Armenians inhabited. Please join me in welcoming Michael Pifer.
Thank you, Catherine, for that extremely generous introduction. I'll try to live up to a small part of it. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I was a graduate student in this program, and it's really shaped a lot of who I am. So I'm just really pleased I'd like to thank the Armenian Studies Program and Comparative Literature for sponsoring my talk today. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about a moment in time that's about 60 to 70 years before my book begins. And I've been trying to work with some of this new material, so it's very new for me, to think about a broader transformation that I'll be talking about at the end of my talk. So, let's get into it. He is wise, not alive. He circulates in many places, but has no feet. Wherever there's a noble house or assembly, he comes boldly forth. He speaks. We find ourselves on the northeastern region of the Mediterranean basin, near the eastern borders of Cilicia, during the latter half of the 12th century. Catholicos Nerses Shnorhali, the head of the Armenian Church, has just recited a riddle, not in Classical Armenian, but in the vernacular language, one whose sponge-like form absorbed loanwords from Arabs, Persians, and Turks in a way the literary language did not. Perhaps Shnorhali's amanuensis looked down at the manuscript to watch his neatly inscribed letters drying like the footprints of a bird in the wet sand. Sitting there, perhaps the answer seemed obvious. What speaks where men fear to tread? Tucht, an epistle, a piece of paper. Herein lies a riddle of another sort, equally worthy of our mental labors. In the microcosmic world of versified vernacular riddles, we glimpse the broad contours of a transformation in Armenian letters, one that would emerge first in Cilicia and eventually spread across diverse Armenian communities in and beyond Anatolia. All of this without feet. This transformation, of course, is the early development of Middle Armenian poetry, itself riddled with the styles, sounds, loanwords, themes, and forms absorbed from adjacent literary traditions in medieval Anatolia. However, much like the medieval English riddle, or sieve, from which our modern word for riddle comes, Middle Armenian literature would not merely admit the vocabulary and literary styles of others into an Armenian-speaking milieu, but would also sift and separate the elements of a translingual poetics, recombining it anew within a Christian interpretive framework. Riddles beat at the heart of this story, and not simply because they represent some of the earliest verse composed in the vernacular Middle Armenian language, making them somewhat analogous to other riddling cultures elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. In this short talk, I will treat the genre of riddles heuristically, as a way of thinking about a particular moment in time, in this case a moment of crisis, that would shape and be shaped by the complex relationships between poets and audiences in medieval Cilicia and its neighboring regions. My talk will consist of 3 parts. First, I will adopt a selective look at Shnorhali's literary production in general, and the challenges that faced him and his religious community in order to shed light on why he began to compose riddles in the first place. In the second part, we will survey and read together a few of the many hundreds of riddles that Shnorhali composed. As I will suggest, these riddles do a particular kind of hermeneutic work, guiding their audiences to seek hidden correspondences between signs inscribed in the Book of the World. Finally, in the third section, I'll consider the ways in which Middle Armenian poetry in general, much like Shnorhali's riddles in particular, took part in a similar hermeneutic project, teaching its audiences to read their communities and themselves according to a particular interpretive logic. Riddles, I will argue, can potentially guide us to become more attentive readers of the literary cultures in which they were produced. To begin, let's return to the riddle we've just examined, as it reflects a growing number of problems Shnorhali had been mulling over for some time. After the collapse of the Bagratid Armenian kingdom in the mid-11th century, the Armenian people had migrated southward and westward in massive waves. Even the see of the church was now beyond the ancestral Armenian homeland, as Cilicia had been founded and settled by the descendants of migrant Armenian nobles. Shortly after becoming Catholicos in 1166, Shnorhali, which means the graceful or the gracious, addressed his scattered flock in a tucht, or epistle, of his own. He addressed his general epistle not only to Armenian believers, quote, here in the Mediterranean, dispersed amongst foreign-speaking peoples, end quote, but even, quote, to those at the ends of the earth, scattered in city and fortress, in village and farm, end quote. In some ways, the general epistle would sow the seeds about a new narrative on the Armenian people, dispersed to the very edges of civilization. However, as our riddle suggests, Shnorhali's general epistle could also do something that he could not. Quote, in this time of evil and of diverse kingdoms, it is not possible to go around all the parts of the world and preach the word of God as the holy apostles did, he lamented. Our nation does not presently have a royal capital or assembly, which formerly allowed us to sit on the patriarchal and magisterial throne, and teach our people God's law as the first patriarchs and doctors did. But we are like the wild goat that has escaped from dogs and hunters to live in caves, lacking even villages and farms to supply our bare physical necessities. We must therefore take care to advise and teach according to our rank, and through our words to pour the milk of God into the mouths of the souls of our children in Christ. As already noted, this is impossible to do in person, end quote. Shnorhali sent his epistle to the prominent churches and cities of his day. Most likely, priests would have read aloud and generally interpreted his words to the faithful, to farmers and field hands, foot soldiers and governors, landowners and merchants. Herein lies something of a great irony. The epistle's pristine classical Armenian, or Gudabar, or the written language, had long been an arcane language, primarily understood by the well-educated. Shnorhali's epistle could go where he could not, circulating amongst his scattered flock without feet. It could boldly call out transgression, avarice, and inequity, but it would also rely on the interpreting tongues of others, who mediated its message to the populace, if it was going to be understood at all. In fact, Shnorhali's problems ran much deeper than communication alone. Notably, the Crusader state of Edessa, just east of Cilicia, had recently come under attack by Imad ad-Din Zengi, while its armies were away. Zengi, the governor of Aleppo, lay siege to the city for months, trapping its thousands of Christian inhabitants inside. The fall of Edessa was a devastating blow to the Christian world, one keenly felt in neighboring Cilicia. Shnorhali absorbed this shock in part by composing a lengthy poem in Classical Armenian, known as the Lament for Edessa, that instructs its audience to share in his grieving. Narrated largely from the perspective of Edessa herself, Shnorhali's poem minced no words in condemning the Muslims as, quote, barbarians, who were like, quote, wolves in a flock of sheep, end quote. Shnorhali would frame his harshest condemnation of Zengi's forces in explicitly religious terms. As Edessa herself explains, after the invading armies, quote, polluted my holy temples, end quote, destroying altars, and trampling the cross, they proclaimed good news to the prophet, whose command they were purportedly following. In Shnorhali's envisioning, Zengi's forces are outright demonic, literally dancing upon the blood-soaked ground while slaking their thirst with alcohol. Even still, the challenges facing Shnorhali, not to mention the Christian faith in Cilicia, do not end here. In some ways, he faced a more immediate problem than the encroachment of foreign armies might suggest. From Shnorhali's perspective, while Orthodox Christianity was under attack from external forces, it faced a less visible siege from within. To understand this siege, which took the form of a protracted cultural war, we have to shift our perspective somewhat and move away from the more openly confrontational, if not breathtakingly violent, opposition between Christians and non-Christians depicted in a work like the Lament for Edessa. Let us therefore envision a different kind of scene, one that helps to shed light on how Shnorhali engaged with his audiences through a form of cultural production. One night, most likely a few hours before the sun rose opposite the fortress of Ramkla, a strange melody caught Shnorhali's ear. He had come across the fortress's guards, standing together, singing a song, perhaps one that evoked light, or even the sun itself. The song certainly wasn't Christian, but we know little about its subject matter. The historian Kyragos Ganzagetsi, who records this incident, would merely call such singing useless, perhaps suggesting it wasn't religious in character, which would certainly have merited a harsher condemnation. Whatever the content of the song, it seems to have deeply unsettled Shnorhali. If such songs were sung at Ramkala, the see of the Armenian Church, what corrupted form did the Armenian cultural landscape take beyond its fortified walls? Shnorhali may have had some idea. He was, after all, a musician himself. Quote, since he was a wise man, Kyragos Ganzagetsi reported, he arranged many works in the sweet melody of the church, as well as many other melodies and poems, end quote. As Ganzagetsi reports, this was the will of the saints, that so far as it was possible, no one should converse in worldly discourse, but from the scriptures, and not in drunkenness and not in merrymaking. On account of this, Shnorhali fashioned songs and taught these to those whom were guarding the fortress, so that instead of useless tunes, they might recite this, whose beginning is the Psalm of David, I remembered your name in the night, Lord, and figuratively continues like this in succession, awaken my glory, which is now recited in the night office of the church. The hymns that Ganzagetsi describes here, Hishetsuk igisheri, let us remember in the night, and Zartik parkim, awaken my glory, dense in psalmic citation, are well known, and are still sung in the Armenian church today. Placed in their earliest historical context, however, such hymns acquire a very performative dimension. We might therefore picture these guards on the threshold between night and day, singing the newly fashioned words of Zartik Parkim to their Catholicos. Arise, children of the light, in praise of the Father of light, they would have sung. Arise, all of you saved by the blood, and give glory to the Savior. Alleluia. Arise, new people, singing a new song to him who makes all things new. It is a hymn, in other words, that brings about, or at least attempts to bring about, the very transformation that it describes. Put simply, through biblical citation, the hymn evokes the formation of a new people who find their voice through song, singing this very same song. In the case of the guards, who apparently were compelled to put aside their useless songs in favor of a Christian hymn, this new song would supersede whatever non- or extra-Christian music had kept them occupied in the weary hours before daybreak. The hymn's composition, therefore, reflects a conversion, or at least a confessional consolidation, not just of a people, but also of certain poetic and musical cultures circulating in Cilicia. Sometimes, for complex reasons, the new song sounds much like the old one. With this in mind, we will now turn to part 2 of my talk, wherein we'll examine Shnorhali's riddles within the broader context of his literary production. As I have briefly sketched for you here, Shnorhali's writings are prodigious. He penned an epic verse poem known as Jesus, the Son, another epic about the history of his family, the general epistle, sundry hymns, and a formal exegesis of the book of Matthew, all in Classical Armenian. However, it was his effervescent and infinitely curious collection of riddles that he composed in Ashkharagan Khosk, country or worldly speech. Not only did Shnorhali versify his riddles as quatrains, but he also composed them in monorhyme, a literary invention in Armenian inaugurated by his great-grandfather, who explicitly adapted the form from Arabic poetry. As was the case with the guards at Hramkla, Shnorhali also had a particular audience in mind. Ganzagetsi explains that Shnorhali, quote, fashioned mysterious proverbs out of the scriptures in riddles, or hanelugus, so that instead of epic storytelling, people might recite these during weddings and wine bibbings. Sounds like fun. It would seem that whereas Shnorhali's general epistle relied on the mediating presence of priests and bishops, his riddles could speak directly and boldly to a variety of peoples, even when their author was absent. We therefore ought to ask, how do riddles work, and what do they do? The meticulous Soviet scholar A. Manatsaganyan has observed that the word for riddle, hanelug, comes from the verb hanel, meaning to draw or pull out, to remove or to divulge. In this, the term shares a closer etymological correspondence with exegesis, which also means to take out, than does the proper term for commentary in Armenian. As Manatsaganyan posited, the term hanelug, quote, is tied not only to the genre of riddles, but generally to all corresponding intellectual activities, end quote, that seek to reveal, quote, matters, appearances, and understandings found in the invisible depths of a text, end quote. Few scholars have attempted to build on this correspondence in the Armenian context, however. Most notably, in a footnote to a groundbreaking article on Shnorhali, James R. Russell has shown that the original ordering of Shnorhali's more than 200 riddles reflects and thereby teaches the basic structure of the Bible, beginning with the order of creation. Shnorhali's collection opens with a riddle on God, this is followed by one on Adam, then paradise, then Adam and Eve, the tree of life, heaven, the sun, light, clouds, the world, time, man, woman, thought, and so on. It also chronologically poses a series of riddles about figures from the Old Testament, Cain and Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and so on. The New Testament, Simon, Christ, and the cross, as well as from Christian universal history, such as St. John Chrysostom, and Armenian history, Grigor Lusavoric, David the Invincible, and Moses Horonasi, the father of Armenian history. Now, readers who engaged with riddles in their written form were probably the most attuned to the biblical ordering of Shnorhali's collection. Tucked away in a monastic reading room, one might conceivably sit for hours, bringing one's brain in silent vexation as one dutifully progressed through a collection of riddles, which were popular in Armenian throughout the medieval and early modern periods. In fact, we know that some monks did just that. As Manatsaganian notes, in the margins of Madanataran manuscript 8652, one scribe boasted, "O brother, for half an hour I wrung my brain. By the grace of God, I discovered the solution to these riddles. Trust in God that you may find the solutions too." And below that, in another hand, a later scribe adds his own thoughts. "If you had really discovered the solution," he writes, "you would have written it down. If you haven't figured it out, don't brag." If Gonzagetzi's report is to be believed, the tortured solitude of a monk might be reborn, however, as a boisterous affair in public. A jostling crowd might shout out answers, while the riddle reciter playfully teased, corrected, offered hints, guiding the public to seize upon the correct or a singular reading. Whether public or private, these exercises, perhaps a few cups deep at the wine tavern, would still have borne an undeniably interpretive and even epistemic dimension. As Winfried Rudolph has argued, riddles, quote, impart encyclopedic knowledge concerning the properties and classifications of things, even as they rely on semantic ambiguity, end quote, that keep the audience guessing. This ambiguity serves a purpose, however, as it teaches readers to seek deeper correspondences between signs inscribed in the book of creation, the world. In this sense, as Rudolph has observed, the literary genre of riddles had a clear exegetical value, as it heuristically guided readers to, quote, reveal the hidden mysteries of things, end quote, in the words of the bishop Aldhelm. In Armenian, riddles were known under a broad umbrella of names, such as Hanelug, riddle, Ariakhzvadz, mystery, Hanelik, thing to be extracted, Banzadzuk, hidden discourse, Araspel, myth or fable, and Arag, proverb, which is the term favored by Shnorhali. One idea is obviously common to all. Namely, one must treat the interpretive object as an analog or a heuristic for thinking about something else. Here is just one way that worked. I die and I perish. Again I rise and am revitalized. I cast my eyes towards heaven. I am luminous like a constellation of stars. With its overt evocation of resurrection, one might initially assume Christ is the solution. But the riddle describes the life cycle of wheat, whose grains fall to the ground only to rise again, pushing up through the soil towards a brilliant canopy of stars. Even in its simplicity, there lies a dense cluster of associations at the heart of the wheat resurrection correspondence. Most immediately, Shnorhali's mysterious proverb evokes another proverb, John 12:24, recited by priests during the requiem service of the Armenian church. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. These words are chanted at the end of a liturgical service in remembrance of the recently deceased. They would have been familiar and perhaps emotionally resonant to Cilician Armenians. There are also additional layers we ought to peel back. In the summer, farmers brought grain offerings to the altar. Their grain, the fruits of their lives, would then be transformed as communion for the faithful, the bread of life. The riddle's veiled correlations are therefore multifold, as they simultaneously evoke the labor of field hands, the burial of loved ones, the growth of wheat, the resurrection of Christ, and the eternal life to come. Even more, these correspondences are present in communion itself. In effect, the riddle offers an audience the chance to reflect together on the true nature of the sacrament. It does not impart this instruction overtly, but arguably covertly, through a coded language and tightly coiled economy of metaphor. Moreover, it does this in a language people might readily understand. Unlike Shnorhali's unmitigated condemnation of Muslims in his lament for Edessa, his riddles exhibit a more polemically playful treatment of other cultures and religious traditions. Who reads like a Syriac priest? A crow. What lives in a mosque and a house of bone? A turtle. Who speaks Arabic and sings songs? The swallow. Other animals would embody, in Shnorhali's eyes, more martial characteristics of the Arabic-speaking world, as we find in the following riddle. She wore red undergarments, and she has a dappled shirt. Entirely like a ball of thread, she fights like a little Arab. The answer here is a partridge, who, for all her pugnacity, still wears red underwear, vardik, beneath her shirt. Here we are invited to reflect upon the physical strength and resilience of Arabs in a subtle and even satirical guise. One might reflect on partridges in terms of this quality that Shnorhali ascribes polemically to Arabs, but the correspondence cuts both ways. An audience could conceivably also re-envision Arab peoples, perhaps even soldiers, the armies that Shnorhali is anxious about, marching in a swaying formation like a flock of partridges. In a similar vein, Shnorhali lifts up, brings down, eviscerates, or slyly mocks a wide array of peoples in this coded language. Franks, like a wolf who devours his own whelps and desires garlic in every piece. Jews, from that which they speak, this great tribe, Christ acquired his body. Assyrians, these, like the Tajik, are always talking. And Armenians, who are deaf to the Assyrians. From the perspective of Christian didacticism, these correspondences help one to understand the hidden natures of people and things. But they even do more. They train their audience to read the ambiguity of the world as merely another code, the veiled language of creation, which then might be deciphered in a similar manner. Occasionally, this code appears entirely opaque to readers today, myself included, in part due to its liberal employment of Persian and Arabic loanwords. Take, for instance, the following. There was a little sheikh, like a friar, and he had a layer of fur on top of his head. Playing cajole, he stands and gets up, and gazes longingly upon the pears. Shnorhali's solution is a bear. In this case, the joke is ecumenical, perhaps evoking the felt conical hats worn in Anatolia around this time, while at the same time transmuting the stoicism of the sheikh or friar into a greedy, bear-like stubbornness. The bear sheikh friar plays cajole, a corrupted loanword from Persian that some have speculated means simply very angry. Despite the bear sheikh friar's serious appearance and formidable form, the riddle suggests, his most base instinct is simply to devour the fruit of another's garden. Perhaps the joke works on many levels then, depending on what correspondences we wish to foreground. There's fur sitting atop the bear's head, but like the friar, he perhaps has nothing going on underneath. His greed is as naked as his bald patch. Of course, this is merely speculation. From a rigidly modern perspective, the presence of foreign substances in the body of Middle Armenian poetry can be as enigmatic as these word puzzles themselves. My short readings of these riddles are meant to be suggestive. We only possess shadowy hints at how audiences might have engaged with these enticing word games. Clearly, however, the genre as a whole is designed to encourage an audience to work through a complex, intermeshed web of correspondences running between these quatrains and the world in which they circulated. At the same time, within their particular hermeneutics of correspondence, these riddles arguably serve to promote and create a sense of difference. By constructing interlocking typologies between scripture, objects, animals, and people. Far from collapsing differences together, typological correspondences often serve to foster a complicated and complex reading of the heterogeneous worlds in which Cilicia was embedded. After all, Assyrians and Franks might both be Christians, but that hardly makes them the same in Shnorhali's eyes. This brings us to our third and final act, in which we will take a large step backwards and examine the broader landscape of medieval Armenian literary production through the lens of riddles themselves. Although Shnorhali was not the first author in Armenian to compose riddles, the genre exploded in popularity during and after his lifetime. In the following 2 centuries, many other riddlers, including prominent figures and intellectuals in the Armenian church, such as Hovannes Yerzengatsi and the bishop Grigor Khalatetsi, would even begin composing riddles in the vernacular beyond the territory of Cilicia. Manuscript collections of riddles, composed by Shnorhali and numerous other authors, would be copied across the diverse cities where Armenians lived, including Erzincan, Jerusalem, Aleppo, Datev, and Zeytun, later spreading to Constantinople, Diyarbakir, and Tbilisi. Nor was the circulation of Armenian riddles limited to manuscript culture. Hagop Mechapard, who lived in Venice in the early 16th century, published a handful of Shnorhali's riddles in the first collection of poetry ever to be printed in Armenian. There are, to my mind, at least 2 ways we might broadly conceptualize the widespread diffusion and wholesale creation of an Armenian riddling culture, which flourished in a moment of crisis that only intensified following the fall of Cilicia and the loss of Armenian statehood in 1375. The first and more prosaic approach is to observe that riddles were already popular among many tongues throughout both the Mediterranean and Iranian worlds. Cilicia, of course, was intimately connected to the networks of mercantile and cultural exchange that wound through both. It is not surprising that Armenian riddlers might be attuned to the adjacent and analogous cultures of riddle production, flanking them on many sides. Nor would it necessarily be surprising that Armenian authors might choose to swing these riddling cultures into a Christian hermeneutic orbit. After all, we don't know what kinds of poetry or entertainment exactly Shnorhali hoped to replace with his own riddles in Middle Armenian. But if his adaptation of a useless song into a new hymn for the Armenian church is any indication, his riddles perhaps were not altogether different from the unknown performances they sought to displace. Still, although Shnorhali is highly invested in the production of typologies, or cataloging the formal characteristics of people and things, I cannot say the same is true for myself. A comparative study of riddles across languages, while certainly illuminating of how ideas and literary forms might spread translinguistically, also might obscure what's happening on the ground historically, when and where and why particular riddling cultures arise. Therefore, at least in my eyes, there is a second and more fruitful, perhaps, way of conceptualizing the rise of Armenian riddling culture in relation to other neighboring traditions. Here, we should observe that riddles, and more importantly, the riddle-like manner of erecting correspondences between dissimilar things, also have a way of infiltrating other genres where we might not expect them to belong. For instance, Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the Iranian epic poem completed in the early 11th century, contains one such very brief episode, wherein competitors briefly test one another's wits in a contest of riddles. No one would classify the Shahnameh as belonging to the genre of riddles, of course, but that is entirely my point. There is a certain logic to riddles that transcends the narrow genre, the riddle form, in different ways. At least in the Armenian case, the rise of a riddling culture itself corresponds with a broader hermeneutic program that transcends the formal constraints of any single literary genre. For example, let us turn our attention to medieval Yersinga, or Erzincan, north of the Cilician border, where poets were composing new vernacular riddles of their own. In this cosmopolitan city, Armenians enjoyed the performances of diverse poetic works, including, we know, of the Shahnameh. The late 13th century poet Konstantin Yerzingatsi, or Konstantin of Erzincan, reports that his audience even requested a new Shahnameh, composed in Armenian, in the same style and meter as the Shahnameh in Persian, for instance. Not only did Konstantin grant this request, but as Theo van Lint has shown, he even recast the poetics of the Shahnameh, including its celebration of feasting and fighting, within a Christian didactic framework. In other words, although Konstantin sought to replicate the metrical sound, style, and lexicon of the Shahnameh for an Armenian-speaking audience, his adaptation also served as a kind of guided reading, one that not only intended to instruct its audience in Christian teachings, but also one that in turn guided its audience to read the poetics of the Shahnameh through Christian eyes. In fact, this interpretive mode undergirds much of Konstantin's poetry in general, which in some cases functions, I'd argue, as a series of extended riddles in all but name. In a now famous poem, Konstantin depicts a brilliant, fragrant garden. Here, the nightingale, or bulbul, he uses the Persian word, falls madly in love with a ravishing rose, even growing intoxicated from its sight and smell. As Peter Cowie has observed, Konstantin seems to have modeled the basic tropes of this poem from Persianate examples, such as in Attar's Conference of the Birds, wherein the nightingale likewise grows inebriated from its sensual rose gazing. There are still additional ways we might understand a negotiation over meaning between Armenians and others within this work, however. Notably, in a second poem, Konstantin complained that his audience had misunderstood the actual meaning of his poetry, as they read according to the flesh and not the spirit. Konstantin then offers a versified exegesis of his original poem, line by line, that explains how each character corresponds to a Christological reference point. The rose, of course, finds its correspondence in Christ, and the nightingale is a stand-in for the angel Gabriel, whereas the other flowers are correlated with those who are jealous of and slander Christ. Even common products distilled from the rose in Konstantin's poem, such as gulba shakar, which is the Persian term for conserve of the roses. It's like a paste that you grind up from rose petals and sugar. Find correspondences along similarly Christological lines. The conserve of roses, he explains, finds its analog in the body of Christ, whereas rose water is Christ's blood. It's important to note that both of these rose-based products were widely consumed by Muslims and Christians in Anatolia for their medicinal value, a value that Constantine instructs his audience to inscribe upon the sacraments of the Armenian Church. Here too we find a dense web of correspondences. One might therefore receive communion in church, reflecting meanwhile on the medicinal properties of the rose, or one might wander through the bazaar, inhaling the aromatic rose products sold by Armenians, Persians, and Turks alike, while partaking meanwhile in this symbolic realm, now transposed upon the quotidian cityscape of Erzincan. Either way, Constantine's rosy hermeneutics extended beyond poetry, and indeed beyond language, to encompass the sensory world in which his audience lived. Constantine, furthermore, was not alone in promulgating this kind of lived-in hermeneutics, an epistemology of correspondences that sought to strengthen confessional ties within a particular community. Other poets of Middle Armenian, such as Khachatur Gecharetsi and Frigg, likewise instructed their audiences in the subtle art of interpretation through their poetic compositions. And I'd be happy to talk more about these afterwards. Now, to be clear, I'm obviously not suggesting that we read the corpus of Middle Armenian poetry as belonging somehow to the genre of riddles. Quite the contrary. We ought to think more broadly about the supplemental hermeneutic work beyond artificially rigid genre lines that Middle Armenian poetry does for its audience at this time. Vernacular riddles therefore serve as a rich heuristic for thinking about the confessional role that medieval poetry played and the immense value afforded to it by its own authors and audiences, at a time when more traditional modes of instruction might not have always been the most expedient. Put simply, this riddling mode of instruction teaches its audience how to read. First, how to read the poetry and poetics that circulated amongst Armenian-speaking communities in medieval Anatolia. And second, how to read the hidden correspondences between the words in the Book of the World, as well as to negotiate one's own place between the covers of that book. Finally, it's also through this hermeneutic work that Armenian riddles perhaps have more in common with other modes of literary production in medieval Anatolia, particularly in other languages, than a comparative typology of riddles across languages might suggest. Shahab Ahmed, for instance, has called the 13th century masterwork by the Muslim Persian poet Rumi, who lived only just westward of Cilicia, quote, an exegesis by other means, end quote. In part because it glosses popular stories in Persian through a Quranic framework, but also the other way around. In other words, Rumi's Masnavi instructs its audience to excavate the correlations between poetic cultures that surround them every day with analogs from the Quran and Hadith literature, but also to understand the Quran through examples taken from popular culture. So it's a kind of double reading. Riddles, quite obviously, also offer an exegesis by other means of their own, but so does much of Middle Armenian poetry in general. This exegetical work, I contend, sought not merely to accommodate difference, linguistic, cultural, and conceptual, but also to transmute difference into a poetics of correspondence or affinity, in which heterogeneity is brought within the apparatus of a particular interpretive framework, an exegesis of scripture, but also a scriptural eisegesis of the world. Thank you. Yeah, please.
So, I have a couple of questions. One was really basic. Oh, okay. Thank you.
For the record.
Okay. Now I'm going to have to be really coherent. I have one kind of simple question and one a bit broader question. So when you showed that wonderful map to show the spread of riddles in the 2 centuries after Shnorhali's death, were those riddles all written in colloquial and in monorhyme like his?
Yes, the majority of them are.
That's so fascinating. Now, my other question, which is much broader, and maybe not all that useful, maybe it's bringing in a category that is not useful to think about this material, but sometimes when you're talking about riddles, riddling texts, it sounds a lot like allegory.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a category that you think is useful to think about these texts, particularly when you're talking about, I think that there's like that much more visceral dimension to the riddles and the much more existential dimension to the riddles that speaks to a lived culture in a multi-confessional environment that's very different from allegory. But when you're looking at texts that are about the rose and the bulbul, then that sounds very much like an allegorical text that also wants you to be thinking about something else. Do you think that allegory is useful to think about this material?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not too married to the idea of like the riddle genre in particular, but rather just the way in which it participates in this broader culture of transferring meaning across categories. So in terms of like the rose and the nightingale, sure, it's definitely an allegory for Christ and for, the sacraments of the church. But I think that the important thing is just training people to reflect back on the sacraments also through the same like allegorical mode. So it's like the double allegory, they're reading each other more than just like, an extra historical realm is transposed upon like history.
I actually don't have a specific question, but I just wanted to add that interestingly, the curation of monorhymed or robai collections that are used as teaching tools seems to pop out in Persian, especially under Attar, not virtually the same time period. So this is really interesting, again, cross-cultural development. It seems to map really well as well onto arguments already made about long-form narratives by Mesami around how we read courtly poetry or long-form romances. This, again, is sort of analogical thinking. So it seems like this is a really helpful bridge, I think, into thinking really beyond a single literary or linguistic tradition. This is really great.
Thank you. I wish I could have gotten into it a little bit more in my talk. But it's not just Iranian worlds that, well, I guess, it definitely is, but that riddles are glossing, or that Middle Armenian poetry glosses at this time. There's a really great example at the same time period from the Armenian translation of the Alexander Romance in Classical Armenian. But then it's glossed with Middle Armenian, they're sort of like riddles almost, short kaphas, again in monorhyme, these little quatrains that are versified, that teach us to read the Romance through like a Christian framework again. So like they don't actually replace the Romance, but they just sort of supplement its reading in a similar kind of manner. Thanks. I also have some riddles if we'd like to try working through some of them together.
So does he give you the answers to all of the riddles in the book?
Yeah, so in the collections of Shnorhali, in the collection of Shnorhali, he definitely does. But in other kind of riddling collections, they do and they don't. One really interesting one has the answers written in Georgian, sort of like adding an extra linguistic block to the readers of the audience. In some ways, I think the answers aren't so important, as is the process of trying to work through like and untangle the possible correspondences that then are fixed, are guided by the interpreter within the sort of Christian hermeneutic mode. But
Michael, thank you. That was lovely. You partially answered the question I was going to ask you, which was about the answers and how they're laid out on the page, and whether they're accompanied by commentary. And of course, because I'm coming from a different part of the world, it hadn't occurred to me that the answers would be given in another language. So I'm sort of off, like wheeling in delight at that possibility. But would you say a little bit more about A, layout on the page in the manuscript, and B, whether there's commentary?
Yeah, sure. So there's definitely different ways they do it, even with Shnorhali. So in some collections of Shnorhali, you'll just find the answer directly after the riddle. And other ones, there'll be like a chart in the beginning that has the answers to all, like in a puzzle book today, has answers to all the puzzles.
Do they come after or before?
They come before.
So I think in Aldhelm, aren't they before?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But they come before in a lot of cases. And sometimes they'll come before, but they don't actually end up they'll leave riddles out, or the answers don't match up exactly with the collections. But again, I think the important thing is the process and not the end point in a way. Training an audience to read and think in allegorical terms or anagogical terms beyond just the collection in front of them in any given moment.
And that's what your two glossators are performing.
Totally. Mm-hmm.
I figured this out. Well, then why didn't you give us the answer? Well, I didn't give you the answer because it's your job, right?
Yeah, totally. They don't write the answers for all kinds of reasons.
Michael, thank you. This is really, really lovely, really incredible. I think using the riddles heuristically to get at these questions of kind of broader hermeneutic practices, I think is really spectacular. And you already know that I have some deep interest in this. So you actually just started touching on where I wanted to take my question, which is looking at Hanel as sort of to extract, to pull out as the basis for what is going on here is quite different than what I know is the other term for exegesis, which is from Megnel, to set out, to sort of go out along the path and, let it take you where you go. And so, in a way, it seems to me that there's a tension between the sort of, singular correspondence that is in the answer and the, this anagogical, allegorical process of correspondences. And I just wondered if you could reflect on that a little further, especially in the light, I think, it's a really, sort of linguistically an interesting tension to have, extraction as one sort of model in the background versus the sort of, wondering of setting out along an interpretive pathway.
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have too much to add to it, but I think however you conceive of the action of making meaning or spinning meaning out of the source material, again, to me, the two important things are that it can be like a two-way activity where you're reading the book of the world, but the book of the world is teaching you to read the text at the same time. In terms of a tension between wandering around like the fields of meaning making versus just extracting a single answer, I guess I don't really see the tension in it quite that stark. I think the riddles, even though the idea is you're extracting a singular answer, the answer forces you to wander around other correspondences once you get to that point. So the reason why they work is because they're not just in isolation. They're plugged into this, network where everything means something, and then everything has to refer back to something else. But you have to, interpret it within this Christological universe for these guys. Yeah, but if you want to follow up on that, then.
No. That's a very nice answer. It's in my thinking about the hermeneutics and the correspondences. I am struck by and like to emphasize the sort of multiple movements and multiple possibilities. And I think I think you're right that it doesn't necessarily have to be a tension, but that the sort of the singular answer or pinning down the correct interpretation does seem to me to be in some kind of tension with the possibility of sort of overflowing robust correspondences.
Mm-hmm. I think to me the the reason why riddles are productive is what ends up happening in the performance of them. Either if you're sitting silently by yourself and you're like performing this kind of interpretation in this very game-like way, but especially like in a group setting where this sort of interpretive wandering can really happen. So maybe we can transition from that to actually try some of this. You know, when I started translating these, I didn't realize how fun they were until I have a friend who just keeps G-chatting me throughout the day, and it's like, what are you up to now? What are you up to now? What are you up to now? So I started telling him I'm doing these riddles, and then he like became obsessed with just guessing the answers to them, and he would just like guess and guess and guess and guess, and this guy was just like undaunted. And the more like difficult it was, or the more like my hints kind of concealed what they're also trying to reveal, the more into it he got. So it really is like something that draws you in, and it's very hard to see, I think, when you're just reading them by yourself. So with that in mind, sorry, Naira, I'm gonna step away a little bit. I don't want to stand there anymore. Maybe we can think a little bit about some of these riddles together, and you can call out answers to me, and I'll try to direct our reading back to the singular answer that Shnorhali wants us to have. So I could see many caravans going down to Khorasan. The donkeys were barefoot and without saddle. They lift a load and come. Don't even. Oh, sure. Like I'm
You know, it works.
riddle moonlighting.
It's a metaphor, really, right? A riddle is a metaphor because you're saying, you know, it is this, but what you mean is that you're actually describing something else.
Totally.
I mean, you said this very eloquently in your talk, but that's I never, you know.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know, I think allegory is very productive, but what's happening is it goes beyond that in a way. Okay, so many caravans going to Khorasan. They're barefoot. They don't have a saddle.
How many riddles does he use the first person singular like this? Because I do this, I do that.
A lot of them.
Oh.
A lot of them. So don't be shy. Step right up and try your luck. Just yell something out. The whole point is being wrong, and then I kind of...
Donkeys are always barefoot.
All right, well, these are fancy donkeys. Pardon? Okay, that's a great answer. That could totally be the answer to this, but it's not.
Can you give us any clues?
It's a very industrious creature.
Like an ant.
Ants, you got it. Yeah, great. Very nice. The answer is ants. Wow, you win the riddle prize. All right, let's try another one. I saw water like fire, also brighter than the moon. It undulates more than the purple sea. It has spilled the blood of many. So, no, again, while you're thinking about that, we come back to this one for a second. You know, you can think about like how Cilicia is also plugged into these like mercantile routes of trade that the riddle like draws upon, even as it sort of, you know, transfers that to this like metaphorical realm. So that's why I think it's like riddles in particular are different from allegory in terms of it's always got something rooted in what's happening. Not always, but often it's got one foot firmly placed in the historical.
I don't think, to clarify, I don't think the riddles are anything like allegory, but I think that those longer texts, you know, that was where it sounded allegorical, like allegory systems, you know, so that there's a blend, there's a continuum when they blend. This is something, you know, unique in a literary way that what you described really beautifully in your talk. Yeah. But go to the next one.
Okay, yeah, so, okay. Oop, don't. I almost gave you the answer. Okay, I saw water like fire, brighter than the moon, undulates more than the purple sea, spilled the blood of many. Okay, so it's something that undulates. It's bad. Maybe you should be cautious. Pardon? Lava? It's not lava.
Dang.
Yeah, it's more a little moralizing than that. Good guess.
Is it going to be another Marshall?
It's not.
Do you have to be an Armenianist to get it?
It depends, I guess, which ones you're talking to. Okay. Waterfall, that's a good guess. Could be the answer, makes sense logically, but it is not. Sorry. Okay, so we're all together. We've had, we're sitting, we're at a wedding, we've had a good time. It's wine, yeah, you got it. Very good.
You get drunk, you get feisty.
Yeah, so here.
That is a very violent image for wine, though.
But
Totally.
also directly Christological, also directly sacramental.
Oh, nice.
Directly.
Nice.
So does this thing purposely, or is he talking about the Red Sea that divides the Egyptians?
Oh, it's really like a very wine dark sea in Armenian, the word he uses.
The word purple here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean here, you can see him, maybe we're at the wine tavern, maybe we're at a wedding, we're enjoying ourselves.
Do they have Homer translated into Armenian at this time?
Not really. Yeah, the word he uses is taken from the oldest recorded pagan work of Armenian poetry. Yeah, so he's kind of like playing with non-Christian or extra-Christian ideas.
Arabic from the Arabic wine songs or versions of
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And he's probably, when you think about like a literary culture that's trying to supplant or supplement another one, while people are drinking wine, perhaps, and enjoying themselves, this is another way you can kind of inscribe a boundary around the things you're allowed to do and the ways you're allowed to be and the things you're allowed to think about while that event is happening. And it also makes reference in sort of an oblique way. You see this motif in other Middle Armenian poems, particularly in the poetry of Frigg, who cites Persian poetry quite often in his verses. And he constantly says, Frigg, you're an idiot, you're a dummy, Frigg. Spill the wine from your head before it's too late for you. Again, trying to inscribe on his audience, a certain way of being, certain things you're not allowed to eat or drink or touch. I think poems or these riddles are also sort of performatively taking part in. Yeah.
So what if a person really has a different opinion about what the riddle is? Did people used to argue about this and get into
I would imagine. In some of these manuscripts, the one answer will be in one, and it will be a different answer for the same riddle in another one. That's why, again, it's not so important what the answers are. What's important is that whoever is leading the exercise is the one with the actual power over the community, in a way. So this is what I really wanted to call you here for today. Okay, let's try two more, and then we're out of time. There was a hotel upon the earth on a transient road, and strangers would come to it, and those who are known would leave. While the guest comes, they honor him, and when he goes, they rob him blind. They don't just take a few of his belongings, but snatch them up in their entirety.
It's the world.
Yeah, it's the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah, fun stuff while you're enjoying your wine. Yeah, and again, this is a motif you see obviously in Christian didactic literature, but in a lot of medieval Armenian poetry as well. Something that my own work mostly looks at. I don't really work on riddles as much, except as this heuristic. This idea of we're all transient strangers, and they use the same vocabulary to describe them, gharibs, in multiple languages. So again, it's drawing from a shared language in a way, but it ends up reifying it or polarizing it around a particular confessional orientation. Okay. We'll close with what will maybe become the epigraph of my book. I like this one. Goes like this. Though it is without wing or feather, it soars faster than the swallow. It wanders aimlessly from country to country. It turns and comes, bringing many guests. Ideas, caravans, those are good guesses. Wind, that's a good guess. Rhythms, definitely, yeah. Oh, riddles. Could be riddles. It's not, but it is music. That's a great one. It could be. I like that, but it's not. Gossip. That's a good one. You still got 2 right though, so that's good. Time. That's a good one. Paper. Very close. It's very, very close. A book. Is that what someone said? It's very close. Almost. A riddle, we said that, but a letter, news. Okay, they're so close. I'm just gonna let you have it. Writing. So again, just nicely to sum up what I've been trying to argue. Although I haven't necessarily been looking at riddles in their written form exclusively, I'm really interested in these kind of like literary genres that draw on a shared language, sometimes literally shared across languages, but then end up trying to reify or again consolidate the confessional boundaries of the community through this shared language or through these like very playful modes. So with that, thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you.